Hello everyone and welcome to a new session on Aloysius Academia. In today's session we will cover something very interesting, which is the cholera toxin. In a previous video I covered or I talked about cholera as a disease. So I introduced cholera, I talked about how cholera is transmitted, what causes cholera. So please have a look at that video first before you start this video, because in this video we will focus on the cholera toxin. So we will see how this toxin affects the cell, how it messes up the movement of ions through the cell membrane, and many other things that eventually will lead to the symptoms that are characteristic of cholera disease. So please don't forget also to have a look at the revision booklets, which are specifically made to prepare you and teach you the specific keywords that are related to this topic in specific. So all the keywords, I have analyzed the past 10 years of past papers, pulled down all the keywords, and then try to introduce them in that booklet. So it will help you a lot and prepare you for the exam. So let's get started. Great. So let's start with understanding how cholera causes the body to lose large volumes of water. So the first thing you need to learn, and that's the one of the most important concepts, is that cholera, it changes ion movement across epithelial cell membrane in the small intestine. Okay, and I believe from teaching students this topic, I found that before we move on, the students need to understand the structure of the small intestine, not in a great details, but just the general structure and the names of specific spaces, so they will be able to picture it then when we go into much more details about the movement of ions and the effects of the cholera toxin. So what you need to learn is that if we imagine that this space here outside, this space is the small intestinal lumen. Okay, so all the food you eat, all the water you drink, they moves into that space first. Once they enters the small intestinal lumen, the walls of the lumen, it's going to be lining of the small, it's going to be epithelial cells. There are going to be other types of cells as well, like for example these ones, goblet cells. They are involved with secreting mucus, but for this topic or this video, today's lesson, just focus on epithelial cells. So these are the epithelial cells, and they are making the vast majority of cells, and they are the vast majority of cells that makes the lining of the small intestinal lumen. So that's the first thing. So that's the small intestine, that's the lumen, and then the walls is going to be the epithelial cells. And then remember that within the cell, it's called the intracellular space. So you have the lumen, and then you have the cell. Within the cell, it's the intracellular space. And then you have this space here. So you have lumen, cell, intracellular space within the cell, and then you have a space below the cells. So this space is called the tissue fluid. So from now on, through the video, when I say intestinal lumen, I mean this area, which is the area where the food and water you eat will go through. And then if I say intracellular space, I mean inside the cell. And then if I say tissue fluid, it means this space that is behind the cell. And within that space, you can find blood capillaries. So blood capillaries, they will be moving very close to the cell. So what happens basically, for example, if you eat some food, the food will be going through your intestine, and then the nutrients will be entering through the cell. The cell will be absorbing, for example, all the nutrients, the important nutrients, and then these nutrients will go into your blood through this in here, and then the blood will just take it to wherever in the body it needs it. Okay. Also, for example, if these cells needs oxygen, the blood will be entering through here, and then the oxygen will move to the cells. If the cell is releasing any CO2, it will also be taken by the blood capillaries, and then it will be taken to the heart and to different parts of the body. So that's generally what's happening. Okay, it's very important that you understand this picture to be able to imagine it and use it when it's needed. So what happens is that when you eat contaminated food or water that is contaminated with the Vibrio cholerae bacterium, so the Vibrio cholerae bacterium will enter your small intestine, and then they will be interacting with the epithelial cells lining the small intestine lumen. Okay. So what happens is that eventually, after the bacterium will be secreting their toxin, it will result in the blood, in the water flowing from the blood and tissue fluid space into the small intestinal lumen. Okay, so the movement of water, it's in that direction. Or if you look at this image here, the water moves from this space, which is the tissue fluid and blood space, into the small intestinal lumen where the food and everything is there. So that's why you will get a very watery diarrhea, because all the water will be moving here. However, cholera doesn't simply makes the water leaks from the tissue fluid and blood into the lumen. So that's not what happens. So what actually happens is that cholera changes the movement of ions across the membrane of the epithelial cells. And as we mentioned in the previous video, that mainly chloride ions, cholera toxin will induce or increase chloride ions movement from inside the cell into the small intestinal lumen. Okay, and since the chloride ions levels will increase in the lumen, then this will result in the water following that down the water potential gradient, or using osmosis. Okay, and we will explain later on how is that exactly happening. But this is just a general idea. This is this slide is just to give you a general idea of the whole process. So now when I start going into deeper explanation, you will understand and can picture what is exactly happening in the body. So as I explained that the cholera toxin will play with the ion movements through the membrane. So let's have a look at what's plasma membrane and how it controls the movement. Understanding that will makes it so easy for you to understand how the toxin, the cholera toxin work. So first of all, that you need to understand the plasma membrane, it's selectively permeable membrane, okay, that surrounds the cell. So if this is a cell, it's going to be surrounded by a cell membrane, and the cell membrane, it's selectively permeable membrane, and it's going to be something similar to that. So the reason that the cells have cell membrane is because it controls the movement of things like ions, like for example sodium, chloride, and potassium ions. Also, it controls the movement of water, of glucose, as well as other molecules. So all these things, they need to go through the plasma membrane before they enter the inside of the cell. So to understand why these things, they need to go through the membrane and how the membrane filter them out, you need to understand three main specific structures of the plasma membrane. Okay, I will explain in a different video the plasma membrane in way more details, but for today we will focus on only three main things, which are the phospholipid bilayer, the channel proteins, and carrier proteins. So if you look at the membrane here, if we zoom in, you will see something like that. So that's the cell membrane. That's the, in our case, let's say that this is the small intestinal lumen, and then this place is the intracellular space inside the cell, and then you have this cell membrane. So the first important part for today's lesson to be aware of is the phospholipid bilayer. So you need to understand that. So that's a phospholipid, and it's a bilayer because, as you can see here, we have this outer layer there, and then we have another layer here. So it is a bilayer. Okay, that's a phospholipid bilayer. And also, if you look at the membrane, there are different things: proteins, glycoproteins, and some of them, they are called channel proteins. Okay, and the reason that these channel proteins are in the membrane is because charged ions, like for example potassium chloride or sodium, they cannot pass directly through the membrane. So they cannot just pass from the outside of the cell through the phospholipid bilayer into the inside of the cell. That cannot be done, and we will see later on why is that not possible. However, for these ions to enter the cell, they need to use specific proteins that are embedded within the cell membrane, and some of them, they are called protein channels. So for ions, they might need some proteins. Some of them, they are called ion channels, carrier proteins, or pumps. So there are different type of proteins that helps the movement of charged ions and polar molecules, and each protein will be playing a different role. But you need, just for now, you need to understand that charged ion cannot pass directly through the plasma membrane. They need these type of proteins to be able to move from inside of the cell to the outside, or vice versa. So maybe now you're asking yourself, why ions cannot move freely through the cell membrane? Why do they need these membrane proteins to move across the membrane whether they are entering the cell or moving outside the cell? And the reason is that ions are electrically charged. So as we can see here, for example, these just a few examples for understanding. So sodium, potassium, they are positively charged. Chlorides, ions are negatively charged. And the middle of the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, it's referred to as hydrophobic. So maybe you're asking yourself now, what does hydrophobic mean? So a hydrophobic molecule, or when we say that something is hydrophobic, it just means that this molecule is water-fearing, or in other words, it means that it doesn't mix well with water. So it's not soluble in water. So that's what it means when you say something is hydrophobic. So it doesn't like water, it doesn't mix well with water. So the plasma membrane is made up of these phospholipid bilayer, made up of phospholipid bilayer, and each of these molecule and structures here, it's called a phospholipid. So that one is a phospholipid, and each phospholipid, it has these two tails that we can see here. These two tails, they are named fatty acid tails. They are a fatty acid tails. Okay, and we can see that the whole phospholipid bilayer is made up of these tails, which are they are considered to be nonpolar, they are hydrophobic, and they are oily or fat-like. Okay, so that's why the whole membrane is considered to be hydrophobic. It's because of the presence of these fatty acid tails that makes the whole membrane hydrophobic, which means it's water-fearing, it doesn't mix well with water. But this still doesn't explain why ions cannot cross through the membrane, because ions are not water. So sodium is not water. So why sodium can't just pass through the membrane? And the reason is that charged ions like these, they interact very strongly with water molecules. So remember that in this context, so you have the cell membrane, the outside of the cell, it would have water, the inside of the cell, it will have water. So ions will be dissolved and interacting strongly with water molecules. Okay, and this strong interaction will make the ions water soluble, and they will be referred to as hydrophilic. So please pay attention to the different wording here. So hydrophobic is water fearing, hydrophilic is water loving or soluble in water. So ions are hydrophilic, so they interact very strongly with water molecules and they dissolve in water, they are soluble. So what happens is that the hydrophobic fatty acid tails, okay, they do not interact well with the charged molecules like the ions and the water soluble substances. So this makes whenever these ions want to move across the cell membrane, their entrance will be rejected by the fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic. They do not mix well with the ions and with any water soluble molecules, so they will reject their entrance. And also they will reject their exit. So if these ions are inside the cell, they cannot just move outside of the cell through the plasma membrane or through the phospholipid bilayer. So that's why the existence of these fatty acid tails is very important for making the cell membrane, as we described it before, selectively permeable. Okay, it doesn't allow everything to move freely across the membrane. Okay, so remember, since the fatty acid tails are hydrophobic and will not allow the ions to enter or move freely across the membrane, therefore ions movement are energetically unfavorable. Okay, what does it mean energetically unfavorable? It means that if they need to move through the plasma membrane, you would need to use a lot of energy to make them across the membrane, and that phospholipid bilayer would not reject them. Okay, so moving freely through the plasma membrane or the phospholipid bilayer is going to be energetically unfavorable, and there where the role of channel proteins comes. So for these ions to move inside the cell or moving outside the cell, they need to use these membrane proteins to bypass the rejection of the fatty acid tails that are lining the whole cell membrane. Great. So now that we understood why ions cannot move freely across the membrane and that we need channel proteins, so now we will focus on a specific channel protein or an ion channel protein. It's called chloride ion channels. And the reason that we need to focus on chloride ions movement is because that's what is related to to cholera, and that's what the cholera toxin does. So cholera toxin will make the chloride ion channels open more than they usually do. So this would result eventually in the movement of chloride ion into the lumen. So if you have a look at this schematic here. So that's an epithelial cell, okay? And that's the lumen, and that's the blood and tissue fluid area. So what happens is that the role of the chloride ion is to allow chloride ions to move from inside the cell into the small intestinal lumen, and this movement occurs through the chloride ion channel, which is this structure here. One of the most important chloride ion channels that you need to remember, it's called CFTR. That's one of the types of one of the chloride ion channels. So what happens is that once the chloride ion enters the small intestinal lumen, water will follow it by osmosis. So the water will move from the blood and tissue fluid area through the cell into the intestinal lumen. So what exactly happens in cholera is that these channels, the chloride ion channels, will be opening more than normal. And then since they open more, this would result in the chloride ions moving more from the inside of the cell to the lumen. And then this would lead to an increase in the chloride ion levels inside the intestinal lumen. An increase in the chloride ion levels inside the intestinal lumen will result in decreasing the water potential, and then the water will move by osmosis from higher water potential, which is the blood and tissue fluid, into the lower water potential, which is going to be the intestinal lumen. And that's why the patient will get diarrhea. So that's basically the main movement of ions that occur through the epithelial cells. You need to remember this movement. So it starts with a chloride ion moving through chloride ion channels into the lumen. This results in an increased level of chloride ions inside the lumen. Then this will be followed by water molecules moving from the blood and tissue fluid area into the small intestinal lumen. Great, so let's have a look now, a deeper look at the mechanism of cholera toxin. So how cholera toxin affects the opening of the chloride ion. So we already know now that cholera toxin, it does result in opening the chloride ion, but how does it do that? Before we start with that, please, if you find this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And also don't forget to comment. If you have any questions about this topic, or maybe you want me to make a video on a specific topic, just write it down and I will try to make a video on that. This support will encourage me to upload more videos. So thank you. So let's continue now with the cholera toxin. So now we are back to the schematic. So I want you to picture the schematic, be able to picture it in your mind, because it's very important to understanding the whole process. So you have this epithelial cells, you have chloride ion channels on the membrane, and the chloride ions move through the chloride ion channels into the lumen, okay? And increased level of chloride ions in the lumen will be followed by water movement from the blood and tissue fluid area or space into the small intestinal lumen, okay? And this is the epithelial cell membrane, all that. That's one epithelial cell. And these small dots and circles, they are representing the chloride ions, increase in chloride ions. So what happens is that the patient get infected with the bacterium, Vibrio cholerae bacterium, either through drinking contaminated water or maybe eating food that was prepared in contaminated water or maybe washed with the contaminated water. Okay, so whatever we mentioned and we learned the different transmission routes for the bacterium in the previous video, so please have a look at that if you need to revise it. So what happens is that the Vibrio cholerae will be in the small intestinal lumen. So let's imagine that this whole area is the small intestinal lumen, and now the bacteria and the bacterium is within it. So what happens is that the bacteria will start secreting the toxin. So the toxin will be within the lumen, and then the toxin will start interacting with the cell membrane of epithelial cells. So they will interact with the specific receptors on the cell membrane, and this interaction will allow part of the toxin to enter inside the cell. Once, and that's very important to the mechanism of the toxin, because once the toxin is inside the cell, they will start messing up and affecting the signaling inside the epithelial cell. So one of the main roles of the cholera toxin is that it results in increasing the level of a specific signaling molecule. It's called the CAMB. So once the toxins enter the epithelial cells, they will increase the levels of CAMB within the cell. And the main role of CAMP is that it will induce the opening of the chloride ion, and that's how the cholera toxin will result in more opening of the chloride ion. Is that through the CAMP? Cholera toxin will increase the level of CAMP. CAMP will increase will make the chloride ion open for longer and more frequently. Okay, so both of these things. So making the chloride ion, which is knowing the important one is called the CFTR, as we mentioned before. So making the CFTR chloride ion channel opening more frequently and for longer time will result in more movement of chloride ions from inside the cell into the intestinal lumen. And this is going to be followed by what? This is going to be followed by water then, because increasing the chloride ions within the intestinal lumen will make the water induces water movement from the blood or tissue fluid space through the cell into the small intestine. So you need to remember this sequence of events. So the toxin will result in increasing CAMP levels. CAMP levels will make CFTR openings more frequent and also opens for longer. And then this will result in an increase in chloride ion movement into the lumen. So that's a question for you now. Think about it. So if chloride ions level increases in the intestinal lumen, so what does that do to the water potential? And this takes us to the next important point that we need to cover. Great. So now this is the next important concept that you need to be aware of to get a full understanding of the mechanisms of cholera toxin. So you need to understand what happens to the water potential in the lumen. So as we know that when the bacterium enters the small intestine, they secrete the toxin enters the cell, and eventually this will lead to chloride ions levels increase in the lumen. So we all know that by now, and hopefully you can picture it all in your head. So now when chloride ions move into the lumen, there are specific things that happens, and you need to learn them, because you might get asked a question on that in the exam. So you need to learn the specific keywords to answer such a question. So what exactly happens when chloride ions start moving more into the intestinal lumen? So the first thing is that the solute concentration in the lumen increases, and I will explain in seconds what we mean with solutes here. But for now, just understand it as chloride ions. So chloride ions concentration increases in the lumen. That's what happens when the movement of chloride ions increases. When there's a higher level of chloride ions in the lumen, this will result in water potential in the lumen to decrease. Okay, why? Because we have more solutes now in the lumen. This decreases the water potential. So once the water potential decreases, what happens is that water then moves from higher water potential, which is the blood and the tissue fluid. So those going to be the higher water potential, okay, because they have less solutes or less chloride, and more chloride levels they're going to be in the lumen. Okay, so water moves from higher water potential, which is the blood and tissue fluid, to lower water potential, which is in this case, the intestinal lumen, which has high level of chloride ions. But you always need to add this to the to whatever to your answer. So the movement happens across partially permeable membrane, and hopefully by now we learned that the phospholipid bilayer or the plasma membrane, it is selectively permeable or partially permeable. And this is the definition of osmosis, and that's it. This is osmosis. Okay, so osmosis is defined as water moving from higher water potential area to lower water potential area, but it's not just moving, it is moving through a partially permeable membrane. That's osmosis. You need to make sure that you include all the keywords when you define osmosis. So yeah, so that's what's going to happen. Increase chloride ions levels in the lumen. This will be followed by water moving from the blood or tissue fluid into the lumen. So an important keyword also for that is related to osmosis is that the movement from higher potential to lower potential, it's known as movement down the water potential gradient. Down the water potential gradient, which is from higher to lower. So now we go back to the first thing that I said, solutes. So what do I mean with solute here? When chloride ions move into the lumen, they increase the solute concentration in the lumen. So solutes are the substance that are dissolved in water or in a liquid. Okay, so any substance that are dissolved in the liquid or in water, they are known as solutes. And in this case specifically, in the case of cholera, they could be things like for example, sodium, chloride, potassium, glucose, protein, any salts, and also some salts. So all these are solutes, and if these solutes increase in concentration in the lumen, this will make the water potential in the lumen decrease, and then this will induce water movement down water potential gradient. So just general terms to be aware of, solute is dissolved substances like salt, potassium, sodium, things like that. Solvent, liquid, it dissolves in the liquid that it dissolves in. So any liquid, in this case water, so any liquid that the salts or any of the other solutes dissolved in, it's called the solvent. And then you have the solution, which is the solute and the solvent together. So water with salt, for example, it's a solution. Water alone is a solvent, salt alone is a solute, put together they are a solution. Now we get to the last important concept for you to understand to get now the full picture of how the cholera toxin affect the cell, which is understanding why the cholera toxin cause watery diarrhea. We touched on that a little bit during the lesson, but now we will go into more details. So as we know, and we are familiar now that what happens in that what the cholera toxin does is that it increases the concentration of chloride ions in the lumen, and then this will be followed by water moving by osmosis from the blood and tissue fluid area into the lumen. Okay. So what happens when large volume of water enters the lumen? First thing that this will make the intestinal content watery. So all the food and all the things that the patients have in their small intestine, they will become very watery. Why? Because there is a large movement of water into the lumen because of the high concentration of chloride ions. So that's the first thing, watery intestinal content. If the concentration of chloride ion is very high, okay, this will be also mirrored by very high movement of water into the lumen, and then this might result in severe watery diarrhea when there is large amount of water entering the lumen. Okay, when the water enters the lumen, it's not only the water that enters the lumen, it's also other electrolytes. So what do I mean with electrolytes here? I mentioned it in the last video, but we will cover it again here. So you need to understand during diarrhea what exactly is lost from the body. So many students, they think that, okay, it's only water that is lost during diarrhea, but that's not true. So you're not only losing water, you're also losing electrolytes. And electrolytes can be things like sodium ions, chloride ions, potassium ions, bicarbonate. So all these substances or molecules, they are electrolytes. So in diarrhea, the patient, they will lose all these things, water along with electrolytes. And that's why severe watery diarrhea could lead to dehydration. And now maybe the question is, okay, so if a person get dehydrated, why is that dangerous? What happens when someone get dehydrated? And that's very important, because understanding this question will allow you to understand why cholera is very dangerous. So when dehydration becomes dangerous is when a lot of water is moving and leaving the blood and the tissue fluid and enter the lumen. What happens is the blood volume will fall. Okay, because remember, as we explained in different schematic, that the water will come from the blood capillaries. Okay, so they will move, they will leave the blood capillaries into the lumen, and that would result in a fall in a blood volume. Decrease in blood volume will result in decrease in blood pressure. Okay, so the patient that is suffering from severe dehydration will have less blood volume and will have low blood pressure. Low blood pressure and severe low blood pressure is very dangerous, because a low blood pressure means that the organs will receive less blood. So for example, if organs like the liver, the heart, if they receive very low amount of blood, this would result in organ damage. So the liver will get damaged, maybe the heart will get damaged, other organs, the kidney, so things, very vital organs, they will get damaged in conditions of severe dehydration, because severe dehydration, it means severe decrease in blood volume, which is resulting in severe low blood pressure, which indicates that there is a severe decrease in the blood reaching vital organs, and that's when cholera become life-threatening. Okay, that's why severe dehydration and severe watery diarrhea would become life-threatening, is because they will result in the damage of vital organs. Lastly, let's now try to explain the symptoms we already learned in the first video about cholera, and try to explain them using the biological sense of what we learned today about the toxin, the cholera toxin. Okay, so we will link the symptoms to the biological effect, and then this will make hopefully everything clear, and it's a nice wrap up to the whole video. So one of the main symptoms of cholera is watery diarrhea, and hopefully by now we know that a watery diarrhea is referring to high levels of osmosis into the lumen. A lot of water moves into the lumen, resulting in watery diarrhea. So now when we see watery diarrhea, we know what is the reason of that, the biological reason for that. Also, the symptoms of cholera is the patients go through or have episodes of thirst and dark urine. And the reason of that is that it's indicating that the body is trying to conserve water. Why the body is trying to conserve water? Because large volumes of water are being lost in the small intestine because of the effect of the cholera toxin. That's why the patient will start feeling thirsty and will have dark urine. One of the main symptoms of cholera as well is muscle cramps. And muscle cramps is referring to the loss of electrolytes. As we said, in diarrhea, the body doesn't only lose water, it's also losing electrolytes, and this is going to be manifested as muscle cramps. And lastly is the low blood pressure and the fast pulses. These are also common symptoms of people infected with or having cholera. And now we know that the low blood pressure and the fast pulses are indication of, or because of the falls in the blood volume. And as we said, all the water that enters the lumen, they comes from the tissue fluid and the blood. And since a lot of water is moving out of the blood capillaries, this will makes the whole volume of the blood falls down, and then this will result in decreasing blood pressure and fast pulses. I hope you found this video helpful. Please write in the comments if you have any questions or you want me to cover any specific topics. Thank you. I'll see you in the new video.